if you're a parent, you know you're not supposed to have a favorite child, right? But let's admit, some children are easier to love than others. But I'm going to confess, and I know this is being recorded, so I've had the privilege of this is my 4th session already at ELF, and this is my favorite. This is the one I've looked forward to the most, because this is something I've just seen through my career of how powerful stories are. Also, just to endorse what Lars was saying, I actually have led a year-round mentoring group, and yesterday I kicked off my 2nd year-round mentoring group. And she's going to be a part of it this year, so which is exciting, and I think it went really well, and I'm really excited for that as well too. So those are my 2 favorite children. But this line, "Story is a Trojan horse for truth," is not mine. It's actually from a book that I read, written by a pastor named Russ Ramsey, who loved art, and he wrote a book called Rembrandt and the Wind, and he talks about how Christians should think about art. And I would commend that book to you. It's quite good. But in that book, he has this line, "Story is the Trojan horse for truth." And so when I read that, I thought, that's such a great line. So I told him then, I said, "Russ, I loved your book, but this line I will never forget, and I'm going to use it over and over and over again." So I've never done this presentation, but when I was approached about the possibility of doing a presentation, I said, "I know the line." So I let him know. I said, "Russ, I'm going to be talking about you in Poland." But let me tell you a little bit about my background. So I've led all kinds of marketing and advertising roles. I've been a communication consultant. I've been a global marketing director. I've been the director of partnerships. I work for the world's largest supported self-publishing company, which means we help authors get published. We've done 350,000 books, 250,000 authors, 6 continents. And the running joke in our company is if someone in the Science Center in Antarctica wanted to publish, we would do it for free, so we could say we cover the globe. But in addition to that, we run self-publishing businesses for traditional publishers. And we've done that for more than 12 years with HarperCollins, with Simon & Schuster, with Hay House, and with Reader's Digest. I've also helped create book-to-screen services for self-published authors and multiple first-look partnerships in Hollywood. So my experience is with self-published authors, with traditional publishing, and also with Hollywood, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well too. And I launched FuseFrame for our company. FuseFrame is something where we actually option books out of our library and control the IP so that we can get them developed in Hollywood. And one of the examples I'm going to share with you today is an example of that. So it's that experience of being able to work in all these different areas that I've seen this common thread of how powerful stories are. And then, as he mentioned, I'm also the president of the Author Learning Center. This was an idea that I had, and our company supported it and invested in it. And a lot of people, when they go to publish, they don't know what to do. And so we created an online tool. And the best way it's been described to me is it's Netflix meets LinkedIn meets Fitbit for authors. 30-day free trial, $9.99 a month, and it helps people get from where they're at to where they go. We also describe it as a GPS for your publishing journey. So I just give you that background so that you know that I'm speaking from a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different experiences, but I see a common thread, and that is how powerful stories are. And then lastly, I myself have published 4 books. So these are the 4 books. 2 of them are children's books that are inspired. The one in the bottom is dedicated to my daughters. It was a story that I told them when they were young. We had a habit. My daughters are in their 30s. They have kids. I have grandkids. But when they were young, I would read stories. My wife did a great job of cultivating reading in our reading culture in our home. And so I would read them a story, or I'd put them to bed. I'd hold a book, and they would have to guess whether I was reading the story or making one up. And so I made up this fictional story about the boy who unknowingly prepared the place where Mary and Joseph would come in the stable. And I told them that story, and they loved that story. So when they got a little bit older, they said, "Dad, you need to publish that as a children's book." I was like, "I don't have time." They said, "Dad, you work for a publishing company." So I was like, "You're right." So I actually dictated it, transcribed it, had a young man do it. And I've had so much fun with that book because when they were younger, we would do book signings together. And then more recently, that top book is a phrase I came up with when I would talk to my grandkids. So I have 5 grandchildren, 7.5, 5.5, 3.5, 2.5, and 1.5. And when the 2 older ones, one night I was putting them to bed and I made up this saying. I said, no matter where we are, no matter what we do, my favorite thing of all is spending time with you. And what happened is they started repeating that, and that became how we started to say goodbye to each other. And so I told my daughters, I said, I think that's important. And then what I've really come to realize is the power of being present in someone's life, and particularly my grandkids' life. And so I wrote that book and dedicated it to my grandchildren. And so I've had such great fun with that. But what it's done, though, is it's led to other opportunities because there's a story in there. And then the book on the bottom right is a book about how a person's worldview is formed. And it's very helpful because it helps you figure out how to engage in a conversation with people. I could do a whole seminar on that. And then the last one has also been fun. It's the top right. It's called The Soul Shines Through, The Surprising Influences, Spiritual Influences on Famous Artists. Most people don't know this, but Van Gogh was a failed missionary. Picasso made a bargain with God for the life of his sister, and his sister died, and he was angry his whole life. But the last works Picasso did were all about the crucifixion, which people don't talk about. Warhol actually went to Mass every day. And anyway, so that book is what it's intentionally trying to tell the stories of the artists to start a conversation with people about the life. None of them were, pillars of the faith. They didn't live a faithful life, and we don't try to portray that. But what we do say is, if you know their stories, you can appreciate their art in different ways. And so I only start here because I want you to know these aren't just things that are theory for me or things that I do vocationally, but these are things that I am actually invested in personally. But I do have a question for you. Does anyone know how many parables there are in the gospel? The Gospels. Okay, it's 28. That's close, but not quite there. We should do that warmer, hotter, colder. Warm. Anybody else? 35. Colder. 40. Really cold, ice cold, poling cold. 30. So some people debate 31 to 32, right? So Jesus, in all the Gospels, I don't know what the word count is, used 31 parables, let's say, right? Because if you look at your sources, I found different sources. So 30 of the texts in the Gospel are essentially stories. Why would he do that, right? It's not just that there's doctrinal statements. It's not just talking about heaven, but there are all these stories that illustrate things. Well, I think there's a reason why. And so we're going to talk about that, these 3 things: the purpose and power of story, how to tell an unforgettable story, and then we'll take any questions that you have. So this is a quote from Steve Turner, who's an author. He said, "Our appetite for story is a reflection of the profound human need to grasp the patterns of living, not merely as an intellectual exercise, but within a very personal, emotional experience." You see, stories are one of the ways that we connect with everyone who is human, because we all have those common feelings and experiences and longings and desires. So one of the purposes of a story is to make the intangible tangible. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with these 2 verses, John 1:1 and John 1:14. Anyone know John 1:1? What, you can say it? Anybody? Yeah. Yeah. And anyone know John 1:14? And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. Right? I have a friend of mine who, when I showed him these verses, he calls John 1:14 the haymaker, which is a boxing term. He said, because if you have a Greek mindset where the word and the idea is the most important thing, John 1:1 gets your attention. But then John, the gospel writer, messes with you, says, because the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, right? So Jesus becoming flesh becomes part of the story of history. And it wasn't just a bunch of propositions that the disciples talked about, but if you go on and you read the rest of the New Testament, they use the word witnesses over and over again. Or look at 1 John. We held, we touched, we tasted, right? It makes the intangible tangible. It makes ideas embodied and observable, right? You hear the phrase, greater love has no man than this, than to lay his life down for his friends. That's a wonderful statement. But you can point to the cross to see what that really means. And one of the stories I'm going to tell you about that we actually have optioned in Hollywood is another way to demonstrate that sacrificial love. There are actions that we see maybe for principles that we don't quite see. And we engage all the senses to convey truth. This is one of the most important things that you can do as a media communicator. When you write, when you speak, when you do a presentation, engage all the senses. One of the best lines I've ever heard was from an editor who was reading a book, and it was about this woman who had a police career. And she wrote her book, her first draft, like it was a police report. It was factually all correct. But the editor said, "Take me into the room. Let me hear what you heard. Let me smell what you smelled. Let me know what you were touching." And so she rewrote the draft. And it was so dramatically different because it put me in her space, being a female police officer in this precinct. And one of the biggest mistakes we often make, particularly as Christian communicators, is we only think about the propositions that we're trying to portray. But you can engage people with senses, right? So Genesis chapter 3, this is Eve in the garden. I'm going to read this. And this is something you maybe have not noticed before in Genesis chapter 3. So now the serpent was the most cunning of all the wild animals that the Lord had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you can't eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat the tree from the trees in the garden, but about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden you must not eat or touch, or you will die." "No, you will not die," the serpent said to the woman. "In fact, God knows that when you eat, and your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Then the woman saw that the tree was good for food and delightful to look at, and that it was desirable for obtaining wisdom. So she took some of its fruit, ate it, and she also gave it to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. Now that's a familiar passage to all of you, but maybe you haven't read it through the lens that I've just talked about. Look at all the senses that are engaged in that story. It's sight and sound. And while there isn't smell, you can see fruit. You can imagine, because of your human experience, what that fruit might have looked like, right? This is one of the biggest opportunities I see for people who communicate, to engage the senses, because it pulls us in to the story in more than just one way, more than just intellectually, right? And that's because the hearer can see themselves in time and space and identify with the character or circumstances. They can see themselves in that story because when we're communicating because people as humans have common experiences, common desires, common longings, right? I don't know if this translates into different languages, but there's a phrase in English that says, "I can see what you mean." I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but think about that for a moment, right? You're explaining something to someone, and the way they explain it is, "I can see what you mean." They're talking about their sense of sight. I see what you mean. It's now clear to me, right? And oftentimes that's because it's conveyed as a story. Stories are not just for entertainment or distraction. They create opportunities for reflection and conversation. The book that I wrote on art, I had a co-author. His name is Mac Powell. Mac is the lead singer and founder of a band called Third Day, if you've ever heard of them. Yeah, there's a whole story about that. He and I met on a plane and have become really great friends. But what we intentionally did not do is make that a Christian book. We tell their stories to create a bridge to start conversations with people. And what we tell them is we want you to have an aha moment, right? There isn't one person that I've spoken with that I can think of in all the years that after we've done that book where I say, did you know that Van Gogh was a failed missionary? Most people had no idea. They know Van Gogh, he's probably one of the most famous artists. But the way we start that chapter is use a little bit of imagination, but imagine Van Gogh sitting in his father's office, who was a pastor and his grandfather was a pastor, and feeling the disapproval and the disappointment of his father because he had failed in this Christian ministry. And then you learn from there, when you look at Van Gogh's art, some of the stuff that he did, you realize he was influenced by the biblical training that he had. It's beautiful in its creation, right? And most people don't notice this, but in the most famous painting, anyone know the most famous painting of Van Gogh? Starry Night, right? Down in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a church steeple. And most people believe, if you know Van Gogh's story, that that was the type of church that he grew up in. And he wanted to paint that into that. That view was probably what he was seeing from the hospital that he was in. And there's no record for sure that there was a church there, but we believe that he was doing that. So that's what you want to do, is you want to use those stories to create that. They illustrate powerful concepts such as forgiveness, redemption, and sacrificial love. In the book I did on worldview, I use movies as an example, because what you'll notice is Hollywood is continually trying to go after these themes and get answers to it, because we all have these longings in our heart. And the most important thing to realize is that stories are not morally neutral, right? They are what I call idea contagions, right? They have presuppositions about what it means to be human. That means whether it's an animated movie, a documentary, a television show, there's assumptions and presuppositions about what it means to be human and what is a well-lived life. So when you think about that, contagions can be thought about as a negative, but they're also a positive, because we can tell stories in a way that gives people a vision of what life can be. So, how do you tell a good story? Whether it's a self-published story, a traditional publisher, or Hollywood, what I've learned is there's the same things they're looking for. The form and the delivery and the media may be different, but there are common elements that make a good story. So there are 6 essential elements. So the first thing you need to tell a good story is what's called the inciting action. This applies whether you're doing development communications, whether you're doing news, it applies to everything. Most stories capture the attention of someone because there's something that kicks off the story. There's some younger people here, you might not get this reference, but one of my favorite examples of that is the first movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, with Indiana Jones. Yeah, I know you're shaking your head. This is what happens when you get old. You lose these movie references, but it's you should watch it. It's a great movie. Anyone remember the opening scene from the first movie of Raiders of the Lost Ark?
Is it the first one he was in?
Yeah.
So he was a young kid, right? He was a scout or something, right?
No, that was a different one. This goes all the way back. He was in a cave, and he was there to take a statue. And then what happens when he takes the statue? Big boulder just is rolling up. So it's just this great opening movie scene. He's running, and you don't know if the boulder is going to crush him. And he gets out of the cave. He's got cobwebs. He falls on the ground. And then anyone remember what happens after that? Surrounded immediately. And what did they do? They took the statue from him. That's the inciting action. It kicks off the whole movie, right? And what you'll look at is the best movies, the best stories always have an inciting action. The best testimonies have an inciting action. The best development communications have an inciting action. In our year-round mentoring group, and actually I did a pre-form seminar on development communications, and I show examples of before and after of people who write letters to try and raise support for their missionary support, and the letters are really bad. And you just follow this format and it changes things. The other thing is you want to understand who the protagonist is, right? Who's someone I want to cheer for? Who's someone that I care about? And the antagonist is what's working against them, right? It doesn't always have to be a person. It could be cancer. It could be poverty. It could be war. You know, I met today in a one-on-one mentoring with a brother that drove 19 hours, wasn't sure he was going to get across the border to come to ELF for the first time, right? Amazing, right? I mean, his story was amazing, right? And then there's some kind of conflict. We all have some kind of conflict in our life. And then what's the resolution? How is it resolved? And then what's at stake? Make it clear what's at stake if things don't happen. And if you take this framework and you think about it and you start to just dissect movies or TV shows or books, the best ones that you're drawn to will have these elements to it. In fact, oftentimes when I'm at writers' conferences, people will come up to me and say, will you read my book? And I'll say, you know what, I'm going to be honest with you. I probably won't, because I get asked to read a lot of books. But here's what I can tell you to do. Will you take your book, take these elements, and go back and tell me where they are in your story and how long it takes before I get to them? And I'll never forget this. I was at the Florida Writers Conference, and I did this one day, and then the next day, this same gentleman came back to me. He had gone up that night in his hotel room, and he said, I didn't get to the inciting action to chapter 9. And he knew that his story was not as powerful as it could be. So I don't know if you all are familiar with Hallmark movies, but you know they get mocked a lot, right? But because they're formulaic. But I dare you to take this formula and watch a Hallmark movie. They follow this formula to the T, right? Hallmark movies, right? What's the inciting action usually, right? Bakery is going to go out of business. The orchard's going to close, right? Who's the protagonist? It's usually the female who's the big-time lawyer in the big city who has to move back to save the family farm, right? Who's the antagonist? It's the banker or investment that's going to close it, right? What's the conflict? Well, do I stay and save the family farm, or do I go back to my big city? What's the problem? Oh, I met the guy that was my high school sweetheart, right? What's the resolution? What's the resolution in every Hallmark movie? She decides to stay, right? And here's something you need to watch for this. They never kiss to the last scene. It's part of their formula. They have all these near misses, but they never kiss to the last scene. That's the resolution. And what's at stake? Well, what's at stake is usually the bakery or the restaurant or the family farm and all of that. It's a formula, and they just print money, right? And then Star Wars, if you break down Star Wars, right? Star Wars is one of the best franchises there is for telling these stories. But it's this formula. It's these things, and the best things. And the ones that don't do well successfully, they're hard. It's hard to do this. Lord of the Rings is this, right? And then here's a way to think about it. The greatest story ever told. I would encourage you just to sometime take the gospel and walk through this exercise of how would you tell the story using this framework. Because people are open to hearing stories, but they might not be as open to hearing a Bible verse. But the greatest, so if you had to say the inciting action, what was the inciting action in the gospel? Actually, it's sin.
Oh, you mean the gospel?
Yeah. I meant the whole Bible. Yeah, it's sin. Sin enters in, right? Now I got a problem, right? And the protagonist is God himself, right? The antagonist is Satan and death working against us. The conflict is who's going to win, right? It's a great story, right? The victory is won. It's secure. And what's the resolution? Well, the resolution is to dwell with God, to remove the penalty of sin and death, right? And what's at stake? That's what's at stake, right? It's just another way to tell the story where people can relate to it because they know that. You can do that with evil in the world. There's a lot of ways that you can use this framework to take the challenges that we find to build a bridge to the gospel. And here's the one thing that I mentioned that I had helped create an event called book to screen pitch fest, right? We did 22 of them. Basically, we would train authors to pitch. We'd give them a chance to practice their pitches, and then we would do a speed dating thing to pitch. And one of the biggest things that authors didn't do well, self-published authors, they didn't resolve their stories. It was just unsatisfying, right? And so you need to resolve the story in a way that is satisfying. I don't have this on a slide, but there's a quote from G.K. Chesterton. It's a paraphrase, but he said, "The mind is like the mouth. It's made to open, but it must close on something solid to be satisfied." Right? And so that's why the resolution, that's why the gospel is so truly the greatest story ever told. If you really understand the inciting action and the conflict and what's at stake, you don't want to leave people hanging there because you got the best resolution possible, right? So this is, I don't know if you're familiar with Ayn Rand. She's written some books that are a little bit controversial, but she has this great quote: "Art is a selective recreation of reality according to an artist's metaphysical value judgments." Now that's a very wordy way to say what I said before, which is stories are not morally neutral, right? You can't help but put your view into that story. Now, history gives us some examples of this. I don't know if you're familiar with Voltaire, but Voltaire was a prolific writer. He produced works in almost every literary form. He authored plays and poetry and novels and essays and scientific works to promote Enlightenment ideas, right? He lived in France when the Enlightenment was exploding. But what was interesting is when he wrote his political treaties and stuff, he was actually exiled or left to go to England, right? But how he captured the minds and imagination of the French people was through his plays. His play Candide, his most famous work, attacks religious and philosophical optimism, right? Because entertainment takes down the intellectual defenses at times. Stories can take down the intellectual defenses. You don't often argue about it. You just consume it without really thinking about it. And Voltaire really caused a whole revolution, having not that long before then being exiled because his ideas were so controversial. And he did a lot of things to deride the Bible. So you could almost argue Kant gets a lot of credit for changing the way people were thinking about the church, but I would actually say Voltaire, through his plays, did as much as Kant, right? Voltaire's ironic style without exaggeration was apparent in all his work, right? So another one is C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of Narnia. This is a quote. This is Lewis's quote. He said, "Everything began with images, a fawn carrying an umbrella, a queen on a sledge, a magnificent lion. At first, there wasn't anything Christian about them. That element pushed itself in of its own accord. Given Lewis's strong Christian faith, that is not surprising. In fact, once the story was established, Lewis said he saw how the stories of this kind could steal past a certain inhibition which had paralyzed much of his own religion in childhood." So in both cases, Voltaire, Lewis, writing ideas into stories, contagions, right? Spreading their view of humanity, their view of what it means to be human, right? Which is why stories are so powerful. Now, I had mentioned to you that one of the things I've done is Fuse Frame, where we actually option and control the IP. The reason we do that is most people don't know this, but Legally Blonde started as one of our books. But if self-published authors own all the rights, so we don't own all the rights. So with our investors, I convinced them we have great stories and we should try and acquire the rights. So this is a book called Balm in Gilead. It's a true story. It's about a 425-page book. It's not that great of a book. But again, it's not about the writing, it's about the story. This is a tribute written by John Withers Jr., a son, about his father, John Withers Sr., who was an African-American who led a logistics unit in World War II. John Jr. wanted to write this book about his dad, and it's, from his birth all the way to his death. But in the middle of that, there's this amazing 180 pages. You see, John, back when there was extreme prejudice against black people in the U.S., led this all-black unit of logistics soldiers in World War II, which meant they weren't to see the front lines, they weren't to engage in battle, they were just to transport things here and there. One of the last things that they were to transport was prisoners from Dachau, which had been freed. And they were not supposed to have any engagement with the prisoners. They were just supposed to transport things. But John Sr. went through and found these two emaciated, scared Polish Jewish boys hiding. And against orders, putting his own life and his unit's life at risk for court-martial, which back then, if a black man got court-martialed, their life was over. They decided they were going to rescue these two boys, hide them in their unit, and get them back to their village. And so they did. And the two boys, one they named Solomon, because they didn't speak any English, and one they nicknamed Pee-wee because he was so emaciated. And so they had to overcome all these obstacles. They were almost caught. And there's some wonderful moments in this story. At one point, the boys were just filthy and in these ragged clothes, and they wanted to clean them up and put them in some, at least, army fatigues. And the boys would not get in the shower. The men were trying to pick them up, and they were screaming and not get in the shower. And John Sr. had remembered what he had seen, the nail marks in the showers. So in front of all of his men, as a commanding officer, he stripped down naked and stepped in the showers to show the boys it was okay. They got him home. The war was ended and the village was coming back. Most of their family was gone. And there's this wonderful picture they took. It's John Sr. and the two boys dressed in army fatigues with army helmets that are above their head, saluting John. And the last thing they said to him is, "In America." They would see him in America. So 40 years go by. John Sr.'s never told anyone this story. John Jr. decides he's going to write a book about his dad and gets this story. And then John Jr. just worked in the State Department. And he said, "I'm going to see if I can find these two guys." So he does. He uses all his connections. And he finds Solomon had immigrated to Israel. And by the time he got to him, Solomon had passed away from cancer. But he talked to his daughter, and his daughter said, "My dad kept that picture in his wallet literally to the day he died." And then one night, John Jr. is at home, and the phone rings, and he picks it up, and he said, "Is this John?" And the person on the phone says, "Is this John Withers?" He said, "Yes." He said, "My name's Barbara. I think you're looking for my dad." And he said, "Can you put him on the phone?" And they put him on the phone. It was a guy named Martin Wingen who had immigrated to New Jersey. And so John's question to him was, "What did my father call you?" And he said with a little bit of a accent, "Peavy." And he knew he'd found him. And so he arranged this reunion between John Sr. and Martin. And here's the crazy thing, is when John's mother passed away, John Jr. was going through the home, and he found the videotape, because this is back in the day when you could walk right to the gate. And he found the videotape of John Sr. and Martin for the first time they'd seen each other. And then they took a picture, and I have these artifacts, took a picture of John Sr., John Jr., Martin and his wife, and Martin's descendants behind him. And the reason that story is so powerful is because it emphasizes and enfleshes and makes visible no greater love has this than a man to lay his life down for his friends. And the beauty of the story is most people never see the outcome of that. But John Sr. got to see the outcome. So I actually am going to email our lawyer when it's our time, because we have both a documentary company interested in this, and we have a scripted film company. I have a scripted film company attached. I'm working through, I think, the last draft on the documentary country.
That's going to be another kind of brothers series?
It's a little bit of Schindler's List. It's a little bit, but there's so many wonderful dynamics in that story, because these Polish boys just think these black men who have only experienced oppression, only experienced prejudice, they just think America is this great place. And little do they know, at that time in America, a black man couldn't go to the same bathroom, same restaurant, drink out of the same water fountain. So there's all these dynamics. But I'm telling you, unless you have no heart, when you see that video of John and Martin seeing each other for the first time, And then the thing that they did, there's some funny scenes too. They were getting stopped for an inspection. Now you have to realize that if they would have gotten stopped and found those men would have been court-martialed. And so they hid the boys in the back of the truck, and they sat on them like it looked like they had bags. And this is in the book when one of the boys stood up and said to the guy, I'm no offense, but allow me to say, Lars, you need to lose some weight. I mean, yeah. So don't take that personally. I can't remember the name of the soldier, so that's what I'm saying. The first part of the story about John Jr., like the book isn't, but in the middle of that is that story, right? And so that's why I believe in the power of story, right? It doesn't always have to be an overt faith-based story to connect to people, because unless you have no heart, unless all your nerve endings are done, are like that story will impact you because of the bravery, These guys showed more courage in the war without ever firing a gun because of what they were willing to do. And then 40 years later to see the fruit of that, right, is just really powerful. And John Jr. now is in his 80s, has some, but the documentary company has already done video interviews with him on that. So I've got a lot more examples of this, but this is why this is. So here's some things you can do. What can you do to make your stories even more effective, right? What can you do to take advantage of the opportunity to tell stories and impact lives? What can you do to support and encourage those who are storytellers and who want to impact people in all media? Those are the questions I would leave you with, right? Taking these frameworks, figure out what can you do to make your stories even more effective. And when I say stories, because of the diversity of things that I work in, I know that these principles work across marketing communications, development communications, movies, TV shows, documentaries, sermons, fundraising letters, all of it, right? Because it ties into that. And then what can you do to take advantage? Where are those places that you can actually, instead of trying to argue propositional truth, use a story to get in? Use the parables as an example. Jesus used that more often than not to get into a discussion or to answer a question with a story, right? And then what can you do to support and encourage people who are doing that as well?